She was 18 years old, she owed nothing, but they put a price on her anyway. In a dying frontier town where law meant whoever held the most guns, Eliza Hartwell stood on a wooden platform while men she had never met argued over what she was worth. Her father's debts had swallowed their land, their horses, their furniture, and finally, her. The crowd smelled like tobacco and cruelty. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, on the flat gray sky above the rooftops, because looking at the faces below meant admitting this was real. Then one man stepped forward and silenced the entire town. If this story moves you, stay until the very end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The sign above Danner's General Store had lost 2 letters somewhere during the previous winter, so it now read Dan ER's in faded paint that nobody had bothered to fix. That small detail told you everything you needed to know about Caldwell Creek, Wyoming, in the autumn of 1887. It was a town that had stopped caring about its own appearance a long time ago. Eliza Hartwell noticed the broken sign because she was looking for something, anything, to focus on besides the 20 or 30 men gathered in the dirt street below the platform where she was standing. She had been standing there for 6 minutes. She knew because she had counted every second since Sheriff Roy Dunbar had put his hand on her shoulder and guided her up the 3 wooden steps with the kind of firm, apologetic pressure that told her she didn't really have a choice. She was wearing her best dress. That was the worst part somehow. Her mother had sewn it from blue cotton the year before she died, and Eliza had saved it for church and special occasions. Now she was wearing it on an auction platform while a man she barely knew read aloud from a ledger that listed every debt her father had accumulated over 4 years. $47 owed to Callaway Grain, Sheriff Dunbar read, not looking up from the paper. $16.20 to the Caldwell Creek Savings and Loan. $82 to Raymond Peck for the use of his bull during spring calving, which Mr. Hartwell promised to pay back in, just get to the total, Roy. That was Clem Whitaker, who owned the saloon and 3 other buildings on the main street, and who had been one of her father's creditors. He was a short man with a thick red neck and pale eyes that moved over her in a way that made her skin feel wrong. We all know the number. Dunbar folded the ledger. Total outstanding debt is $411. Thomas Hartwell has no remaining assets of value. He paused. His daughter, Eliza Ann Hartwell, age 18, has agreed to serve as indentured labor to settle the balance. She had not agreed. Not exactly. But she had been the one who signed the paper because the alternative was watching her father go to prison, and he was already a broken man who coughed through most of the night and couldn't lift a bale of hay without stopping to rest. He'd sat at the kitchen table the morning she signed, with his hat in his hands and his shoulders curved inward like something in him had already collapsed, and he hadn't been able to look at her. She'd told him it was all right. She'd said it so many times that she'd almost started to believe it. She did not believe it now. Starting bid is set at $100, Dunbar said, and he finally looked up at her, briefly, with something she might have called guilt if she thought he was capable of it. Terms are 2 years of domestic service, cooking, cleaning, livestock care, whatever the employer requires within the bounds of 100, Clem Whitaker said immediately, before Dunbar had even finished the sentence. A murmur ran through the crowd. Eliza breathed very carefully through her nose. The sky above the town was the color of old pewter, and a wind had started coming down from the north that bit at her ears and the back of her neck. 100 from Mr. Whitaker, Dunbar said. Do I have 120? That was Pete Norris, who ran the livery stable and was known for paying his hired hands 2 days late every week without explanation. He was grinning at her. He had very few teeth. 140, said a voice from the back she didn't recognize. Don't look at them, she told herself. She fixed her eyes back on the broken sign. Dan Ears. Someone had written something in pencil on the wooden post below it, but she was too far away to read it. She imagined it said something useful. She imagined it said, keep breathing. 150. 160. The numbers climbed with an almost casual cruelty, like men at a card game raising the pot without thinking too hard about it. She was a problem to be solved, a debt to be transferred, and the winner would get 2 years of labor out of the arrangement, and everyone would tell themselves that was a fair exchange and go home to their suppers without losing any sleep. Whitaker bid again at 175, and something about the way he said it, low and certain, like he'd already decided the outcome, made her stomach turn over. She had a plan. It was a bad plan, and she knew it, but it was the only one she had. She would do whatever work was required with her eyes open and her mouth shut. She would save every penny she was owed, and she would be gone before the 2 years were finished one way or another. She had never been to Cheyenne or Denver or anywhere with more than 300 people, but she was going to one of those places eventually. She was going to learn something useful. She was going to stand on her own feet, and she was never going to be in a position like this one again. That was the plan. $200. The number hit the crowd like something thrown. Several conversations stopped. Pete Norris turned around. Clem Whitaker, who had been fishing a coin from his vest pocket, went still. Eliza looked away from the sign. The man standing at the back of the crowd was tall. Not unusually so, but the way he stood made him seem taller than he was, shoulders back and feet apart, like someone who spent most of his time outside and had never quite learned to make himself smaller for indoor spaces. He was wearing a brown work coat that had seen considerable use and a hat that wasn't quite black and wasn't quite gray, just the color of something that had been in the weather for years. He had a short, dark beard going slightly gray at the jaw, and he was probably somewhere in his mid-30s, though it was hard to be certain with men who worked outdoors. He was not looking at her. He was looking at Clem Whitaker, and his expression was completely neutral. "Wade Mercer," someone said quietly, near the front of the crowd, and the name moved through the assembled men in a particular way. Not fear exactly, but a kind of recalibration, like they were all adjusting their estimates of something. $200 from Wade Mercer, Dunbar said, and he sounded slightly relieved, though she couldn't figure out why. Whitaker's pale eyes moved from Mercer to Eliza and back again. Something calculated happened in his face. $210. Mercer didn't change his expression. $250. "Mr. Mercer," Dunbar began. "I heard the amount owed," Mercer said. His voice was quiet but carried clearly. $411. I'll pay the full sum, and you can close the ledger and send the girl home to say goodbye to her father. Dead silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. "The terms are for 2 years of—" Dunbar started again. "I know what the terms are." Mercer's jaw tightened slightly. "Do you have any other takers willing to pay the full debt?" Dunbar looked at Whitaker. Whitaker was doing the math behind his eyes. Eliza could see it, and whatever calculation he arrived at made him press his lips together and look away. $411 was real money, more than he wanted to spend on something he'd been expecting to get at a discount. "Going once," Dunbar said, with the weariness of a man who just wanted to be done with his afternoon. "Going twice." Mercer still wasn't looking at her. He was watching Whitaker with a patience that didn't seem hostile so much as absolute, like he would stand there all day if he needed to. "Sold," Dunbar said, "to Wade Mercer for $411. Miss Hartwell, you may step down." She had approximately 40 minutes to pack her belongings and say goodbye to her father. Thomas Hartwell met her at the door of what had been their home and would now belong to the bank, and he held her for a long time without saying anything. She could feel how thin he had gotten through his shirt, the sharp lines of his shoulder blades, the way his breathing hitched slightly when he exhaled. She pressed her face into his collar and breathed him in, tobacco and wood smoke and something underneath that was just him, the smell she'd known her whole life. And she told herself she was not going to cry until she was alone somewhere. "Eliza," his voice was rough. "I'm sorry. I am so—" "Don't." She pulled back and looked at him. His face was older than it had any right to be, carved deep with lines that hadn't been there when her mother was alive. "Just get better. Find work with Patterson if he'll have you. I'll send money when I can." "You don't know this man." His hands tightened on her arms. "Mercer. Nobody knows much about him. He came out here 3 years ago after his wife died. Keeps to himself mostly. Roy Dunbar says he's decent enough, but he's not Clem Whitaker," she said. "That's enough for right now." Her father didn't look convinced, but he helped her carry her 2 bags to the front of the house. And when Mercer's wagon appeared at the end of the street, a solid, well-kept freight wagon pulled by 2 dark horses that looked like they were genuinely fed and cared for, Thomas Hartwell stood very straight and watched it come. Mercer climbed down from the wagon bench without hurry and walked to where they were standing. Up close, he was more weathered than he'd looked from across the street, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the look of a man who didn't waste much time or movement. Mr. Hartwell, he said, and offered his hand. Her father shook it. Your daughter will be treated fairly. She'll have her own room, fair wages above what the debt requires, and she can write to you whenever she likes. Her father studied him for a moment with the eyes of a man who had trusted the wrong people too many times. You bought her like a piece of furniture, he said quietly. I want to know why. Something moved across Mercer's face. Not offense, exactly. More like recognition. Because I have 2 children and no help, and I needed to solve a problem before winter, he said, and because I didn't like the alternative. He didn't elaborate on which alternative he meant, but from the slight shift in her father's expression, she thought he understood well enough. He loaded her bags into the back of the wagon himself and waited while she and her father said their goodbyes. He didn't pretend not to be watching. It wasn't that kind of politeness. But he kept his distance and kept his face toward the street. She climbed up onto the wagon bench without help and sat with her back very straight and her hands folded in her lap and watched the town of Caldwell Creek recede behind them as the horses moved into their working stride. Neither of them spoke for almost a mile. Then Mercer said, without looking at her, You can ask whatever you're thinking. Eliza looked at the road ahead. It was a long road, stretching west through grassland that had gone the color of dry straw in the autumn air. Why did you really do it? I told you I need help. You could have hired someone. I tried, 3 times in the last year. He was quiet for a moment. None of them stayed. Why? Another pause, longer this time. My children, he said finally, and his voice had changed slightly. Something underneath the flatness now, something that might have been fatigue or something older than fatigue. They're 6 years old, twins. They've been through a lot and they're not easy to be around right now. How not easy? The corner of his mouth pulled in a way she couldn't quite read. The last woman I hired quit after 9 days. She left a note that said they were agents of the devil. The one before that didn't even leave a note, just her apron on the porch railing. Eliza was quiet for a moment. And you thought buying someone at an auction would solve that problem. I thought someone who couldn't afford to quit might be more patient. She turned to look at him directly, which she hadn't done yet. He felt the look and returned it briefly before his eyes went back to the road. His were dark brown, she noticed, and tired. That's a very cold thing to say to someone, she said. Yes, he agreed. It is. I'm not going to be patient with children because I have no choice. If they're genuinely awful, I'll tell you so, and we can figure out something else. He looked at her again, longer this time. All right, he said. And I'll need to know what I'm walking into. What happened to their mother? His jaw tightened. Fever. 2 winters ago. I'm sorry. So am I. They drove in silence for a while. The wind came across the grassland in long, cold sweeps, bending the dry stalks in waves, and the sky had deepened to the color of iron. She was cold. Her coat was thin, and the wagon bench offered no shelter, but she wasn't going to say so. After a while, Mercer reached behind him without comment and produced a heavy wool blanket from behind the bench, which he handed to her without looking away from the road. She took it and wrapped it around her shoulders and said nothing. Mercer Ranch appeared after nearly 2 hours of driving, rising out of the flat grassland in a way that was less impressive than it was solid, like something built by a person who cared more about whether it would last through winter than whether it would look good in good weather. The main house was 2 stories of dark timber, wide-porched, with a stone chimney at each end. Behind it were a barn large enough to hold serious livestock, 2 outbuildings, a fenced corral where 3 horses stood in the fading afternoon light, and stretching away in every direction, cattle. More cattle than she'd expected. How many head? She asked. He glanced at her. About 800. That's not a small operation. No. So why is it struggling? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, because running 800 head of cattle and raising 2 grieving 6-year-olds alone is about 4 people's worth of work. And I've only got one of me and a couple of ranch hands who've got enough to do already. She looked at the house as the wagon rolled toward it, light in the downstairs windows, smoke from the left chimney. Are they in there now? Clara and Ethan? Bess Coulter watches them in the afternoons. She'll be leaving when we get there. He hesitated. I should warn you that they know you're coming." "What did you tell them?" "I told them I'd hired someone to help around the house." "What did they say?" The corner of his mouth did that thing again, that unreadable pull. "Ethan said he'd been nice to the last one and it hadn't worked, so he wasn't going to bother this time." Clara didn't say anything. "Which one is more trouble?" "Clara," he said immediately. Without question. Bess Coulter was a broad, practical woman in her 50s who met them at the door with her coat already on and her opinion of the situation written plainly on her face, which was to say she looked at Eliza with a measuring sort of sympathy that landed somewhere between good luck, girl, and you'll need it. "They've had their supper," she said to Mercer, already moving past him. "Clara spilled hers on purpose and then said it was an accident. Ethan ate fine. I put a plate aside for you in the kitchen." She paused at Eliza. "You're younger than I expected." "I get that a lot," Eliza said. Bess looked at her for another second, then nodded once. A small thing, but it felt like something passing, and went down the porch steps into the gathering dark. The house smelled like wood smoke and cooked beans and something underneath that was hard to name. Not dirt exactly, not neglect, more like the smell of a place where people were doing their best, but where certain things had been allowed to slip because there were only so many hours in a day. The entry hall was dim. A row of coat hooks held one man's coat and two small jackets. Boots were lined up below them with varying degrees of precision. The floor was swept but not scrubbed. "Clara, Ethan." Mercer's voice wasn't harsh, but it landed with weight. "Come out, please." Silence. Then the sound of small feet on floorboards, and two children appeared in the doorway to the left. Eliza's first thought was that they were beautiful in the specific, almost painful way of children who look like one parent and another parent combined into something neither could have been alone. Dark hair, their father's, and something in the bone structure of their faces that must have come from their mother, a fineness that sat oddly on their 6-year-old faces. They were wearing matching gray clothes that had clearly been mended more than once. Ethan was looking at the floor. Clara was looking directly at Eliza. Her eyes were dark and entirely unimpressed. "This is Miss Hartwell," Mercer said. "She's going to be helping out for a while." "Like the others," Clara said. Not a question. "Her name is Eliza," Mercer said. "You'll address her respectfully." Clara's eyes moved from Eliza to her father with a deliberateness that was almost adult. The others had names too. Ethan still hadn't looked up. Eliza crouched down, which put her below eye level, which was not comfortable in her dress, but seemed important. Clara blinked. She hadn't expected that. "Your father's right. My name is Eliza," she said. "And you're right that the others had names too. I'm not planning to be like them, but you have no reason to believe that yet, so that's fine." She looked at Ethan's bent head. "You don't have to look at me if you don't want to." A long pause. Then Ethan looked up. His eyes were exactly his sister's eyes. Same dark color, same shape, but where hers were challenging, his were wary, careful. "Mrs. Adler said we were too much work," he said. "That's what she told Papa." "I heard you drove the last one out in 9 days," Eliza said. "That's actually impressive for a 6-year-old. Something flickered in Clara's expression. Not quite a smile, but something. "We didn't drive anyone out," she said, with the specific dignity of a child making a fine distinction. "They chose to leave." "Fair point," Eliza said, and stood up. Bam. Mercer showed her to a room at the end of the upstairs hallway. Small, with a window that faced east, a narrow bed with 2 quilts folded at the foot, a chest of drawers, and a single hook on the wall. It was clean. More than clean, she realized, when she looked at the chest of drawers and found that someone had dusted it recently, carefully, including the corners. He'd prepared it before he came to town, before he knew what she would be like. She didn't know what to do with that, so she set it aside. "Outhouse is behind the barn," he said from the doorway. "I'll have one of the hands bring water up in the morning for the basin. Kitchen starts at 5:30. I need breakfast before the hands arrive at 6. The children eat at 7, and Clara has—" He stopped. "Clara sometimes won't eat what's put in front of her. She's not being difficult. She just has particular things she will and won't eat?" Eliza asked. "Something like that." "What is she like?" He looked slightly surprised by the question. "Eggs. Most things with eggs, not beans, not any kind of stew with carrots. She eats bread if it's fresh, he paused. I don't know why I know all that. Because you pay attention to her, Eliza said. That's why. Something moved across his face that she didn't have a word for. He nodded once and said he'd be up before 5 if she needed anything, and then he was gone, and she was alone in her small, clean room at the end of the hall, in a house that wasn't hers, in a life she hadn't chosen, on a piece of land she'd never seen before today. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and breathed. The bed was firm, the quilts were thick, the window glass was cold but solid, no drafts from the frame. Whoever had built this house had known what they were doing. She was not in Caldwell Creek. She was not on that platform. She was not within reach of Clem Whitaker's pale, calculating eyes. That was something. It wasn't everything, but it was something she could work with. She was up at 5:15, which was before Mercer, which she'd done on purpose. The kitchen was large by frontier standards. Big cast iron range along the east wall, a table that could seat 8 good copper pots hanging from a rack above the work surface. Whoever had stocked it had done so practically, without waste. She found flour, salt, lard, dried beans, cured meat, a crock of something she discovered was apple butter, and a basket with 6 eggs. She made biscuits. It was the first thing she knew how to do well enough that she didn't have to think about it, and not thinking about things was valuable at 5 in the morning in a stranger's kitchen. Mercer appeared at 5:40, stopped in the kitchen doorway, and looked at the biscuits cooling on the rack with an expression she couldn't interpret. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. He poured coffee from the pot she'd put on and sat at the table and drank it. He wasn't a man who needed to fill silence, she was discovering. Most people, she'd found, were uncomfortable with quiet and would talk to fill it. He seemed to regard silence as simply another weather condition, something to move through without particular agitation. She put a plate of biscuits on the table and sat across from him with her own coffee and waited. After a while, he said, The hands won't say anything about where you came from. I'll make sure of that. She looked at her coffee cup. And in town? People in town will say what they want to say. A pause. They usually do. What will they say? He was quiet for a moment. Probably that I've got another one who won't last. She nodded slowly. And what do you think? He looked at her across the table. In the gray morning light coming through the east window, his face was plainer, more tired, more human. He looked like a man who had not slept well in a long time. I think, he said carefully, that you're someone who's had a bad run of trouble through no fault of your own, and that you're tougher than you look, and that I don't know yet whether that's enough. He picked up a biscuit, turned it in his hands. I think I've been wrong about people before. So have I, she said. He broke the biscuit open. Steam rose. He looked at it for a moment, then at her. These are good, he said, which she understood was not really about the biscuits. The first week was not easy. Clara was not openly hostile, which was somehow worse. She was watchful in the way of a child who has been disappointed too many times to waste energy on direct attack and has instead developed a more refined strategy of waiting for the inevitable failure. She followed Eliza with her eyes. She observed. She pointed out, with devastating factual accuracy, each of the 3 instances in the first 3 days when Eliza did something differently than it had been done before. Mrs. Fowler strained the milk before she put it in the pitcher, she announced, from her position at the kitchen table, watching Eliza's hands. Was Mrs. Fowler the one who left after 9 days? 7. Clara's eyes didn't waver. She stayed 7 days. Did straining the milk help her stay longer? A pause. No. I'll strain it if it matters to you, Eliza said. Hand me that cloth. Clara did not move for a moment. Then, slowly, she got up and handed over the straining cloth without comment. It was not agreement, but it was something. Ethan was different. He was quieter than his sister, more inward, and he had developed a strategy of simply disappearing, not running, not hiding, just becoming somehow invisible, folding himself into corners and small spaces and watching from there. On the second day, Eliza found him in the barn, sitting in the hay with his knees pulled up, doing nothing, just being very still. She sat down nearby and was also still for a while. You don't have to come find me, he said eventually. I'm not finding you, she said. I just came out to check on the chickens. He looked at her. The barn cats had discovered her and wound around her legs with their usual indiscriminate enthusiasm. Mrs. Adler used to say she liked children, he said. She said it the first day she came. I haven't said that. No. A pause. One of the cats jumped into her lap without invitation, which was the way of barn cats. She scratched it under the chin. My mother used to sit in the barn, Ethan said, when things were hard. She didn't say anything to that. It didn't seem like something that needed a response. She just sat with him in the hay while the cats moved around them and the light came through the boards in long, dusty lines. And after a while he uncurled a little, and they sat together in the quiet. And that seemed to be enough for the moment. Tom. By the end of the first week, she had established certain understandings that were not rules so much as facts about how things were going to work. Clara was responsible for collecting eggs in the morning. Not as punishment, not as assigned chore, but because Eliza had noticed that Clara had a particular relationship with the chickens that was somewhere between private and proud. She knew each bird by some characteristic she'd assigned it. She had opinions about which hen laid most consistently, and the morning she came in from the coop, she always seemed marginally less armored. Ethan was responsible for nothing specific. Eliza had watched him for a week and determined that he was the kind of child who needed room more than structure, who responded better to being invited than required, and who would help with almost anything if you were doing it yourself and simply didn't make a production of including him. At mealtimes, she made eggs in rotation and never made a stew with carrots. Wade Mercer ate whatever was put in front of him, thanked her at every meal, and never once commented on the management of his children, which she appreciated more than she'd expected to. On Saturday evening of the first week, after the children were in bed, she was sitting at the kitchen table mending a tear in one of Ethan's shirts when Mercer came in from the barn with hay in his hair and the particular tiredness that comes from physical work done past what the body wanted to do. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without asking, and sat across from her with the other. You haven't quit, he said. It's been a week. The record is 9 days, he said, and it was almost, not quite, but almost, dry. She kept her eyes on the mending. Clara tested me 4 times today. I know, I saw the last one. She'd been trying to get Clara to come inside for lunch, and Clara had looked at her from 20 feet away with absolute composure and said, You're not my mother and I don't have to do what you say, which was true on both counts. Eliza had said so. She'd said, You're right. You don't have to do what I say, but your father asked me to have lunch ready at noon, and there's cornbread, and I'm going in now, and you can come or not as you choose. And she'd gone inside. Clara had appeared at the table 3 minutes later, not looking at anyone. She didn't expect you to walk away, Mercer said. I know. The others, he stopped, tried again. They usually either tried to force the issue or they cried. He said the word cried without judgment, just as fact. I'm not going to force a 6-year-old to do anything she doesn't want to do, Eliza said. And I'm not going to cry in front of her because she's watching me to see if I'll fall apart. Mercer was quiet for a moment. How do you know that? She kept mending. Because that's what I'd do, she said. If I were her. He looked at her across the table. She could feel the look without seeing it, a particular quality of attention. You're not what I expected, he said. You said you'd been wrong about people before. I said I didn't know yet. She bit off the thread and held up the shirt, checking the seam. And now? He was quiet long enough that she looked up. His face in the lamplight was hard to read. It was usually hard to read, but there was something in his eyes that wasn't tiredness for once. I think I might have gotten lucky, he said. For once. She folded the shirt. Outside, the wind was starting. The cold, persistent wind that came down from the north as autumn deepened, the kind that found every gap and draft in the walls and reminded you that winter was not a suggestion. She could hear the horses shifting in the barn. I need you to understand something, she said. I'm not going to be a servant who disappears into the background and smiles and causes no trouble. I know. I'm going to tell you when I think something isn't working, and I'm going to tell you when I think something is working, and I'm going to tell you if your children need something that I don't know how to give them. I'd want you to, he said. Good. She set the mended shirt on top of the pile. Then we understand each other. She picked up her coffee cup, and they sat for a while in the yellow lamplight, while the wind moved around the corners of the house And outside, Mercer Ranch settled into the deep quiet of a frontier night. And inside, something that wasn't quite trust but was moving in that direction took its first small root. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, on a Tuesday afternoon with a sky the color of old pewter and the first real threat of snow in the air, Eliza found Clara sitting on the top step of the porch with her arms around her knees, staring at the gray horizon. She sat down beside her, not close enough to crowd her, just nearby. After a long time, Clara said, without looking at her, "Ethan says you're not going to leave." Ethan might be right. He's usually not. Well, Eliza looked at the horizon too. The light was going early now, the days getting shorter. Maybe this time. Another long silence. The wind came across the yard and moved through the dry grass in long, shivering whispers. She liked this time of day, Clara said. Our mother. She used to come sit out here when the light went gold. A pause. It's not gold today. No, it's not. She said the gold ones were the best ones. She said they were a gift. Clara's voice was entirely flat. Not because she didn't feel anything, Eliza had learned, but because she'd learned to flatten it so nothing could get out unexpectedly. She said not all days had them. Eliza looked at the iron sky and the cold, flat light. She wasn't wrong, she said, but the gray days keep you alive too. They're just not as pretty about it. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think she's somewhere?" Eliza considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I hope so." That's not a real answer. No, but it's a true one. She looked at the child beside her. "I think the part of her that loved you is in you. I think that's real." Clara didn't respond. She kept staring at the horizon. But after a minute, she shifted slightly on the step, just slightly, so that her shoulder was a fraction closer to Eliza's arm. It was such a small thing, barely anything. It was everything. The night she'd arrived, lying in the narrow bed in the small east-facing room, Eliza had made herself a list. She made mental lists when things were bad. It was something she'd started when her mother died and continued through everything since. You could not always control what was happening, but you could name things. You could count them. "Things I know," she told herself that first night. "The bed is firm. The quilts are thick. I am not in Caldwell Creek. I have my own room." He dusted the chest of drawers before he knew I was coming. She hadn't known what to make of that last thing then. A man who dusted a chest of drawers for a stranger. A man who paid $411 and then said, in a flat, exhausted voice, "I didn't like the alternative," and didn't explain further. She was beginning to understand him now. Or to begin to understand, which was different, which was more honest. He was not a simple man, and he was not a demonstrative one, and he carried something very heavy and very old that she thought probably had a lot of shapes. Grief, responsibility, guilt about things she didn't know yet, the specific loneliness of a person who is surrounded by need and has no one to be needed by. He was not going to be easy to know. She was starting to think she had the time. Outside the east window, the first snow of the season began to fall. Not dramatic, not a storm, just the quiet beginning of winter, flakes drifting down through the dark in a silence so complete you could almost hear each one land. Eliza lay in the narrow bed with 2 quilts pulled up and listened to the snow falling on Mercer Ranch, and for the first time since she'd stood on that auction platform in the town with the broken sign, she did not feel like a person in the middle of someone else's crisis. She felt like a person in the right place, at the wrong time, waiting for the time to become right. The snow kept falling. She slept. The snow that had fallen quietly on Eliza's first night at Mercer Ranch did not last. By morning, it had melted into the hard ground and left nothing behind but a wet cold that settled into the bones and stayed there. And within 2 days, the land looked exactly as it had before. Brown grass, gray sky, the particular blankness of Wyoming in early November. But something had shifted, in small ways that were hard to name. The chest of drawers in her room now held her things. Her boots were on the porch beside the children's. When Mercer's ranch hand, a quiet man in his 40s named Cal, came in for coffee in the mornings, he stopped calling her ma'am and started calling her by her name, which in the economy of frontier men meant something. The ranch itself was a harder problem. She had understood from the beginning that it was struggling, but she had not understood the specific shape of the struggle until she'd been there long enough to see it from the inside. The cattle operation was sound. Mercer clearly knew his work, knew his land, and the animals were healthy and managed competently by Cal and the one other hand, a younger man named Dietz who was enthusiastic and made up for what he lacked in experience with sheer willingness. The house was functional, the outbuildings were maintained. None of it was falling apart in any obvious way. What was failing was harder to point to. It was the dinner that didn't get made because Mercer was out until dark solving a problem with the fence line, and neither child could reach the stove. It was the hole in Ethan's boot that had been there for 3 weeks because nobody had had time to ride to town for a replacement. It was the way the parlor was simply never used. The door stood open and the room was clean and the furniture was decent, but it had the particular stillness of a place that nobody went into because going into it meant remembering someone who used to sit there. It was the account books that Mercer kept at the kitchen table and studied on Sunday evenings with the expression of a man counting ammunition and finding the number lower than he'd hoped. Eliza started with the practical things because that was all she could address. She fixed the menu so that meals happened at predictable times, whether Mercer was in from the range or not. She wrote down every piece of clothing, equipment, and supply the house lacked and presented it to him on his third Sunday at the account books as a single prioritized list, which he looked at for a long time and then said, "Half of this I could have done months ago if I'd stopped to think about it." "You've had other things to think about," she said. "That's not an excuse." "It's not an excuse. It's a reason. There's a difference." He looked at her. "You sound like a school teacher." "My mother was one," she said, which surprised her. She hadn't meant to say it. She looked back at the list. "Ethan's boots are the most urgent. He's been cramming his foot into the left one by folding his toes, and I only noticed because he's been walking funny for a week and wouldn't tell me why." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "He wouldn't tell me either. He didn't want you to worry." The account book was open between them to a page of numbers in Mercer's tight handwriting. She could see enough of it to understand that the margins were thinner than she'd initially assumed. The ranch wasn't failing, but it was one bad season away from difficult decisions. "I can take them to town on Friday," she said. "Get boots for Ethan and a few other things on the list. If there are accounts at the general store, I can put it there." He nodded. He wrote something at the margin of the account page. "Donahue's on the main street will have what you need. Tell him I sent you." "Will that cause trouble?" she asked. "In town." He understood what she was asking. "Probably," he said. "People will talk." "Let them," she said, which was easier to say on a Sunday night at the kitchen table than it would be on a Friday morning in the middle of Caldwell Creek's main street. But she meant it. She did not sleep particularly well that night. The children's situation had improved in the way that real improvements happen, slowly, unevenly, with reversals. Ethan had quietly adopted her as a fact of his life in a way that wasn't warm exactly, but was steady. He would sit near her while she worked. He would answer questions when she asked them. One morning he'd shown her, with great seriousness, a collection of stones he kept in a box under his bed. Not anything special, just smooth creek stones in colors he liked. And she had sat on the floor of his room and looked at each one and asked what he called them, because they all had names, and he'd told her in a voice that was carefully monitoring itself for signs that she was going to think this was stupid. She hadn't thought it was stupid. She'd told him the dark red one looked like the color the sky went sometimes just before a storm, and he'd stared at her and said, "That's exactly what I thought," in a tone of profound relief. And from that point forward, he'd told her things. Clara was not Ethan. Clara was 6, going on 40, and she held her positions like a general who had studied the terrain. She had thawed to Eliza slowly and incompletely, and some mornings she appeared to have refrozen overnight for reasons that weren't obvious, and Eliza was learning not to take this personally, which was easier on some days than others. The morning of the Friday trip to town, Clara came downstairs dressed, but with her hair not braided, which she normally did herself. She refused help with it, had refused since the autumn after her mother died, according to Mercer, who told Eliza this in the flat voice he used for facts that cost him something to say. But that morning Clara appeared at the kitchen table with her hair loose and dark around her face and sat down and poured herself milk and said nothing. And Eliza brought the braid comb without comment and stood behind her and began working through the tangles with her fingers first, gently, from the ends upward, the way her own mother had done. And Clara sat very still with her hands around her milk cup and let her do it. She didn't say thank you, but she also didn't say stop. They rode to town in the wagon, which Eliza drove herself because she'd learned the horses in her second week, and because Mercer was out with Cal dealing with a section of fence that had come down in the night. The sky was low and white, and the air had teeth in it. Ethan sat between her and Clara on the bench and pointed out a hawk circling over the grass to the east, and Clara said she'd seen it first, which was probably true. And they argued about it in the comfortable, specific way of children who have been arguing since before they could fully form sentences. Caldwell Creek looked smaller than she remembered, which surprised her. It had felt enormous on the platform, vast and cold and full of faces. Now it was just a main street with a dozen storefronts and frozen mud ruts in the road and a few horses at the hitching posts outside the saloon. The saloon was Whitaker's. She kept her eyes away from it. Donahue's general store smelled like leather and dried herbs, and the particular dry warmth of a wood stove worked hard. The man behind the counter was middle-aged with a gray beard and the economical movements of someone who spent their life in a specific space and had learned its dimensions precisely. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and his voice was neutral in a way that wasn't unfriendly. "What can I do for you?" "A few things for the Mercer Ranch," Mr. Mercer said to put it to his account. "Course." He reached for his ledger. "Ethan, you've grown a foot since August. What do you need?" Ethan, who had been examining a display of pocket knives with the attention of someone who is aware they're not allowed one but hasn't stopped hoping, looked up. "Boots," he said. "My old ones are too small." "Both of them," Eliza said. "He's been managing with the left for a while. He can't." Donahue looked at her over his ledger with an expression she couldn't read. "Mercer didn't mention that last time he was in." He didn't know. Something shifted in the man's face. Not quite approval, but adjacent to it. He came around the counter and measured Ethan's feet with a worn cloth tape and produced 2 pairs for comparison, and they settled on a sturdy brown pair that fit correctly and made Ethan stand differently in the way that children stand differently when they're not quietly managing pain anymore. She was listing the other items when the bell above the store door rang, and she heard, without turning around, Clem Whitaker's voice. "Well," he said, "Mercer's girl." She turned around because not turning around was worse. He was standing inside the door with a man she didn't recognize, and he looked exactly as she remembered. Short, thick-necked, pale-eyed, with the addition of a slight smile that had no warmth in it at all. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. "Didn't think you'd last this long," he said, conversationally, like they were discussing the weather. "What is it, 6 weeks? 7? 8, she said. 8. He pulled off his gloves, finger by finger, unhurried. "He treating you all right out there?" Mercer's not a man who explains himself much. People find that hard. "I find it fine." He looked at the children, who had both gone still. Ethan had moved slightly behind Eliza without quite hiding. It was a small movement, instinctive, barely perceptible. Clara was looking at Whitaker with her particular direct gaze that gave nothing away. "Kids look well enough," Whitaker said. "Considering." He looked back at Eliza. "You know what happened to the others? Before you?" "I know they left," she said. "One of them came to work for me after," he said. "Over at the saloon. Said the man was cold as January, not a word of thanks for anything, no warmth in the house at all. Said the children were—" He made a small gesture that she didn't like. "Well, children without a mother tend to go one of 2 ways, don't they?" Donahue had gone quiet behind his counter in the way of a man who wants no part of something. "Is there something you needed at the store?" Eliza asked. "Mr. Donahue looks like he's waiting on you." Whitaker smiled again. "Just being neighborly." He looked at her for a moment longer with those flat, pale eyes. "You know, if the situation out there gets uncomfortable, the offer I made in October still stands. Room and work at the saloon. Better than being stuck on a ranch in the middle of nowhere with 2 wild kids and a man who—" "Thank you," she said. "No." "You sure? Because—" "I'm sure." Her voice was level. She turned back to Donahue. "I also need thread, 3 spools of black and 1 of gray, and a pound of salt if you have it." Whitaker was quiet for a moment. She could feel him behind her, that flat, evaluating gaze. Then he moved to the other side of the store, and Donahue began filling her order, and the tension in the room dropped approximately 3 degrees, but didn't go away entirely. On the wagon bench outside, Clara sat very close to her on the left, and Ethan on the right. and neither child spoke until they were past the edge of town and back on the road west. Then Ethan said, "I don't like him." "You don't have to," Eliza said. "Papa doesn't like him either," Clara said. He told Cal that Whitaker is the kind of man who smiles at things that shouldn't be smiled at. Eliza thought that was an accurate description. "Your father's a good judge of people." Clara was quiet for a moment, looking at the road. "Are you going to tell him what happened in the store?" "Yes." "He'll be angry." "Maybe," Eliza said, "but not at us." Clara seemed to consider this. The wagon moved through the cold white afternoon, the horses working steadily, their breath coming in small white puffs that dissolved in the air behind them. After a while, Clara said, without looking at her, "She used to take us to the store, our mother. She'd let us each pick one piece of candy from the jar on the counter." A pause. "It was always peppermint. Ethan always picked something different and then wanted mine." "That sounds about right," Eliza said. "I didn't mind," Ethan said with the dignity of someone making an admission. "I just liked picking." "He always wanted the lemon one and then remembered he didn't like lemon," Claire informed Eliza. "I like lemon now," Ethan said. "You don't." "I do." "You don't." Eliza let the argument run. Overhead, the hawk Ethan had spotted earlier, or possibly a different hawk, turned slow circles in the white sky, and the road ran west through the grass toward the ranch, and the children argued about lemon candy in the specific comfortable rhythm of people who have argued the same argument many times before, and it sounded like family. It sounded so much like family that it caught in her throat for a moment. She kept her eyes on the road and drove. That evening, she told Mercer about Whitaker, briefly and plainly, while they were in the kitchen after the children were in bed. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee cup. "He's going to keep doing that," he said. "I know. It bothers you." "Some," she admitted, "but not the way he wants it to." He looked up at her. "What do you mean?" "He wants me scared enough to leave or desperate enough to take whatever he's offering. I'm neither." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "What bothers me is that the children heard it. That's not... They don't need to hear that kind of thing." His jaw tightened in the way she'd learned meant he was managing something. "No," he agreed. "They don't." Clara handled it better than Ethan. Clara handles most things better than anyone should have to at 6 years old. The words came out slightly rough, like they'd caught on something on the way out. "That's not... I don't know if that's something to be proud of or not." "It's both," Eliza said. "Most true things are." He looked at her for a moment. "You're doing that thing again." "What thing?" "Sounding like a school teacher." "My mother would be very pleased to hear that," she said, and he did something she hadn't seen before. He almost smiled. Not completely, not the full thing, but the near miss of it, the architecture of what a smile would be if he remembered how. It lasted about 2 seconds, and then his face went back to its usual careful flatness. But she'd seen it, and she filed it away next to the dusted chest of drawers and the wool blanket on the wagon bench, in the part of her mind that was quietly assembling a more complete picture of Wade Mercer. November deepened into something serious. The cold was not the exploratory cold of October anymore, but the committed cold of a Wyoming winter that had made up its mind. The ranch hands came and went in layered coats, their faces red at the cheeks, the cattle requiring more attention as the temperature dropped and the water sources began to freeze at the edges. Mercer was out from first light to dark most days, and some days he didn't come in for the midday meal at all, and she would leave something wrapped and warm on the back of the stove for whenever he returned. The house was different than it had been in October. She was aware of the change, but would have found it hard to put into exact words. It was not that anyone was happier, necessarily. Happiness was too large a thing to arrange, and grief didn't follow schedules. Ethan still disappeared sometimes. Clara still had mornings where she came to the table already armored. Mercer still sat with the account books on Sundays with the expression of a man calculating difficult odds. But the meals happened, the boots fit. The mending was caught up. On cold evenings, increasingly, all 4 of them ended up in the same room. Not planned, not arranged, just the way of people in a cold house with one good fire, gravitating toward warmth. She had started reading to them in the evenings. Not as a formal thing. She'd been reading to herself one night when Ethan appeared in the doorway of the parlor in his socks, drawn by the sound of her voice. And she'd shifted on the settee and kept reading without comment, and he'd come in and sat near her feet on the rug. The next evening, Clara appeared as well, positioned at the far end of the settee with 2 feet of deliberate space between them. But there. Within a week, it was a thing that simply happened after supper, she read, and the children arranged themselves near her. And occasionally Mercer appeared in the doorway of the parlor and leaned against the frame and listened for 10 minutes before going back to whatever he needed to do. One evening, he didn't go back. He came in and sat in the chair by the fire and listened until the chapter ended, and when Ethan fell asleep with his head against the settee cushion, it was Mercer who lifted him and carried him upstairs without waking him. She heard his footsteps going up and coming back down, and then he reappeared in the parlor doorway. "Same time you put him down every night, and he's out in 20 minutes, he said quietly, since Clara was still technically awake, though barely. Tonight he makes it 20 minutes into the story. He trusts the situation, Eliza said. His body knows it can let go. Mercer looked at his sleeping daughter, who had slid sideways on the settee with her mouth slightly open, every guard dropped in unconsciousness. She looks younger when she's asleep, he said. She is younger, Eliza said. She just works very hard not to seem it. He looked at her. In the firelight, his face was different than in daylight. The lines were softer, the tiredness showed more clearly, but also more honestly. I should have hired help before it got this far, he said. I kept thinking I could manage. You did manage, she said. That's different from doing well. He was quiet. Outside, the wind moved around the house with its particular winter voice, finding all the old familiar gaps. The woman who came before you, he said, Mrs. Adler, the one who stayed 9 days. He stopped. What about her? She told me that the children were damaged and I should consider boarding school for Clara. He said it flatly, but the flatness cost him. That Ethan was fine, but Clara was, she used the word feral. Eliza looked at Clara asleep on the settee, 6 years old, with her guard down for the first time all day. She was wrong, she said. I know that. He said it quietly, like a person who had needed to say it out loud for a while. I knew it then, but I was tired and she was leaving and I was looking at another winter of... He stopped again. I believed it for about 2 days, that it would be better if Clara was somewhere else, that she'd be easier somewhere she wasn't reminded of everything all the time. His jaw tightened. That's a thought I'm not proud of. But you didn't do it. No. Because? He looked at his daughter again. Because she's mine, he said simply. Both of them. Whatever state they're in. She would remember that later, that exact sentence, the way he said it. Not as a declaration, not with any weight of grandeur, just as a plain fact, the flattest truth he knew. Both of them. Whatever state they're in. She picked up Clara without waking her. She was heavier than she looked, solid, a dense little person, and carried her upstairs, and Mercer followed to make sure the lamp was out and the covers were right. They stood for a moment in the doorway of the children's room, which was also something new. They had settled into a habit of these brief shared pauses at the end of the evening, not talking, just occupying the same quiet space, checking that things were as they should be before separating for the night. I got a letter from my father today, she said, quietly, so as not to wake the children. He looked at her. Is he all right? Better. He's working for Patterson like I told him to. He sounded... She searched for the right word. More like himself. She paused. He asked about you. Mercer seemed faintly surprised by this. What did you tell him? That you were fair, she said. That the work was hard but honest. That the children were... She looked at the 2 small sleeping shapes in the dimness. That they were worth the effort. He was quiet for a moment. That's all you told him? She looked at him. What else should I have said? He held her gaze for a second, then looked away. Nothing, he said. Good night, Eliza. Good night, Wade. She had started calling him that about 2 weeks ago, and neither of them had acknowledged it formally. It had just happened, slipping from Mr. Mercer to something shorter and plainer, the way things did when formality started costing more than it was worth. She lay awake for a while that night, listening to the house settle around her. She thought about the store and Whitaker's pale, assessing eyes, and the way he'd said Mercer's girl like it was both a description and a diminishment. She thought about what it meant to belong to a place, not legally, not contractually, but in the way that you started navigating a house in the dark without bumping into things, in the way that the horses knew your step, in the way that a child who had driven out 3 people before you reached for your hand on a cold wagon bench without thinking about it. She wasn't sure when Mercer Ranch had stopped being a place she'd been sent and started being a place she was. She wasn't sure it mattered when. Outside, the wind kept its conversation with the walls, and somewhere across the dark yard, one of the horses made a sound in the barn, and the fire settled in the downstairs hearth, and the house breathed around her like a living thing. And Eliza Hartwell, 18 years old, who had stood on a platform in a dying town and been sold like a debt, lay in her narrow bed at the end of the hall, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, felt something that was not quite safe, because nothing on the frontier was ever quite safe, but was close enough to it that she could close her eyes without holding them shut. It started with Ethan. She almost missed it, which was the thing that scared her most afterward, how close she came to thinking it was nothing. He'd been quiet at supper, quieter than usual even for him, and he'd only eaten half his plate, which she'd noticed but attributed to the story he'd been distracted by all afternoon, a book about horses she'd found on the parlor shelf that he'd carried around like something precious. He'd gone to bed without argument, which was not unusual, and she'd checked on both children at 9 the way she always did and found them sleeping. And she'd gone to her own room and read for 20 minutes and put out the lamp. She woke at 2 in the morning to a sound she couldn't immediately name. It took her a few seconds, sitting up in the dark, with her heart already going faster than the situation seemed to call for, to understand what she was hearing. It was Ethan's voice, low and continuous, coming through the wall. Not words, just sound, the specific underwater murmur of a child talking in the grip of something. She was in the hallway with her lamp lit before she was fully awake. He was burning. That was the only word for it. She touched his forehead and pulled her hand back at the heat, and then pressed it there again, firm, making herself hold it. His skin was dry and scorching, and his eyes were half open but not seeing her. They were tracking something on the ceiling that wasn't there, and his lips were moving with that continuous quiet murmur that she now understood was not words at all, but the sound of a child's body working very hard at something. "Ethan." She kept her voice steady with effort. "Ethan, I'm here." He didn't respond. His hands were fisted in the blanket. She checked Clara in the same bed. They still shared, by their own preference, and found her cooler, normal, and then looked again at Ethan and made herself think rather than panic, which was harder than it sounded at 2 in the morning with a burning child in front of her. "Water. Cool water, not cold. Keep him from chilling while you bring the temperature down. Find out how long he's been like this. Get Mercer." She did the water first because it was immediate and she could do it herself, going downstairs in her nightgown with her lamp and filling the basin from the kitchen pump. And when she came back and pressed the damp cloth to Ethan's face and neck, he flinched away and then stilled, and she kept her hand on his arm so he knew where he was. Then she went to Mercer's door at the end of the hall and knocked. He answered faster than she expected, which meant he'd been either a very light sleeper or already awake. He came to the door in his trousers and undershirt, with his hair disordered and his eyes sharp in a way that said he'd moved from sleep to full alert in the time it took to cross the room. "Ethan," she said. "Fever. Hi." His face did something complicated and went still. She watched him cross the hall in 3 steps and crouch beside the bed and press his hand to his son's face, and she watched what moved through his expression: recognition, fear, the specific fear of a person who has seen this before and knows what it can mean. And then she watched him put it somewhere and close over it. "How long?" he said. "I don't know. He was fine at 9. "Clara?" "Normal temperature. I checked." He looked at Ethan for a moment, at the dry flushed skin and the half-open eyes, and then he stood up. "I'll ride for Doc Hennessy in town." "In the dark?" "Horses can manage the road," he said. "I know it well enough." "Wade?" She said it quietly so as not to wake Clara. "That's 2 hours round trip if everything goes right. I need to know what you want me to do while you're gone, and I need to know if you've seen this before in him." He stopped. He looked at her. She could see the thing he was carrying. Not just tonight's fear, but older fear, stacked underneath it. The specific weight of a man who had watched someone he loved go the same direction and had not been able to stop it. His mother, he said. It came out flat. It started with a fever. I know, she said. She didn't say I know. It's not the same thing. She didn't know that, and saying it would be a lie meant to comfort, and he would know it was a lie, and that would make it worse. Go get Hennessy. I'll keep the fever down as much as I can, and I'll stay with him. If Clara wakes up, I'll manage her too. He looked at her for another second. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was holding something at a distance by force of will alone. Don't let it go above... He stopped, swallowed. If he starts shaking, real shaking, put him on his side. I will. He nodded once, went to his room for his coat and boots, and she heard him go down the stairs and out the back door, and then the sound of the barn, and then hoofbeats moving away from the house into the dark. She sat on the edge of Ethan's bed and dipped the cloth and pressed it to his neck and talked to him in a quiet, steady voice about nothing in particular. The horses, the hawk he'd seen over the grass, the stones in the box under his bed, whatever came to her. She didn't know if he could hear her. She talked anyway because silence felt worse, felt like giving ground to something. Clara woke at 4. She came awake cleanly, the way she always did, from one second to the next, and she looked at her brother and then at Eliza, and her face went through several things very quickly before settling into a stillness that cost her. Is he dying? She said. No, Eliza said. He has a fever and your father's gone for the doctor. Come here. Clara climbed over the blankets and sat beside her without hesitation, which was itself a measure of how frightened she was. She didn't calculate the distance, didn't manage the approach, just came. Eliza put her arm around her, and the child pressed into her side and was very still. His eyes look wrong, Clara said. His body's working hard and it's using most of what he has. That's why he looks like that. She kept the cloth moving, forehead, neck, the inside of his wrists where the pulse ran close to the surface. Talk to him. He can't hear me. Maybe not. Talk to him anyway. A pause. Clara was quiet for a moment with her face very controlled. Then she leaned forward slightly and said, in a voice that was about half the size of her usual one, Ethan, you have to stop being sick because you still owe me from the lemon candy argument, and you can't be right if you're sick. It doesn't count. It wasn't what Eliza had expected, but it was Clara, exactly Clara, the most Clara thing she could have said. Keep going, Eliza said quietly. Clara kept going. She talked about the stones, about the hawk, about the brown boots that finally fit right, about a plan she had for the summer involving the creek to the south of the ranch property that she hadn't told anyone yet. Her voice low and unsteady, but continuous, and Eliza kept working, and outside the dark pressed against the window and the cold made the house tract and settle around them. Mercer came back at 5:15 with Doc Hennessy behind him, a gray-haired man in his 60s who smelled like cold air and horse, and who examined Ethan with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had seen the full range of what frontier illness could do and had learned not to show his hand until he was sure. He took Eliza aside in the hallway afterward while Mercer sat with the children. You did right, he said, keeping him cool, keeping him on his side when it got worse. It got worse while you were coming, she told Mercer when he appeared in the hallway doorway. Around 4:30, he started shaking. I did what you said. Something moved across Mercer's face. How bad? Bad enough. It stopped after about 10 minutes. Hennessy looked between them. Fever's started to break, he said. He's not out of it yet, but the direction's right. Whatever you did tonight, he nodded at Eliza. You did the important things, and you did them right. Keep the fluids in him when he's able. Keep him warm but not hot. I'll come back tomorrow afternoon to check on him. He looked at Mercer. He's going to be all right, Wade. It's not... He paused. It's not what happened to Anne. Different kind of thing. Mercer said nothing for a moment. Thank you, Tom, he said. Hennessy left as the light was beginning to come up, gray and cold, through the east windows. Claire had fallen back asleep in the armchair in the corner of the children's room, folded into it sideways with her cheek on her fist. And Ethan was sleeping too, differently than before. The terrible working tension was gone from him, and he was just sleeping, just a boy sleeping. Eliza stood in the doorway and felt the exhaustion hit her like something physical, all at once, the way it does when the thing you've been holding against finally releases. Mercer appeared beside her. They both looked at the room. You should sleep, he said. So should you. I'm not going to. Neither am I, she said. He looked at her. In the early gray light, he looked older than his years and younger at the same time, like the fear had stripped away whatever managed presentation he usually maintained and left something more unfinished, more actual. I sat in that room 2 winters ago, he said, with Anne. I kept thinking if I stayed awake it meant something, that it would matter. He stopped. And it didn't, she said. No. He said it without bitterness, which somehow made it harder to hear than bitterness would have been. She died anyway, 4 a.m. The children were asleep. He paused. I've been afraid of 4 a.m. ever since. She wanted to say something useful, something that wasn't hollow. He's going to be all right, she said instead. And it was hollow too, even though it was true, because all right didn't touch what he was actually talking about. He seemed to know she knew that, because he nodded once and said nothing more. And they stood in the doorway of the children's room together, while the light grew in the east window and the house warmed slowly from the night. I don't know how you did that, he said finally. Stayed that steady. Alone with them. In the dark. I wasn't steady, she said. I was scared. You didn't act scared. There wasn't room for it, she said. That's different from not feeling it. He was quiet for a long time. The woman before you, Mrs. Adler, the 9 days one, when Ethan got a cough in her second week, she came to my door at 10 at night and told me she couldn't do this, that she hadn't signed up for illness, and that I needed to make other arrangements. He said it without expression. I don't blame her. She was a widow herself. She'd been through enough, but He stopped. But you needed someone who would stay, Eliza said. I needed someone who understood that staying is sometimes the whole job. He looked at her. You understood that before I did. She didn't have an answer for that, so she said nothing. Ethan woke at mid-morning with the fever still in him but diminished, the dangerous quality gone from it, and he looked at Eliza with eyes that were actually seeing her and said, in a voice like gravel, My head hurts. I know it does, she said. Where's Papa? Downstairs. Do you want him? In a minute. He was quiet, looking at the ceiling with the careful expression of someone taking inventory of themselves. I remember you talking, he said, last night, while it was... He didn't finish the sentence. I could hear you. Good, she said. You talked about my stones. I did. The dark red one. He swallowed. You said it was the color of the sky before a storm. I remember. He looked at her. His face was pale and the shadows under his eyes were deep, but his eyes themselves were clear. That's still exactly what I thought, he said. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, still warm but manageable, the difference between a fire burning hot and one burning down. Rest, she said. I'll bring you broth when you're ready. Clara appeared from the armchair where she'd been watching all of this with her arms folded and her expression carefully assembled, and she climbed onto the bed and sat beside her brother with her back against the headboard and picked up the horse book from the nightstand and opened it without saying anything. Ethan watched her for a moment, then closed his eyes. In the hallway, Eliza leaned against the wall and let herself breathe. Mercer was at the kitchen table when she came down, not at the account books, but just sitting, his hands around a coffee cup, looking at the window and the cold white morning beyond it. He looked up when she came in. Better, she said. Clara's with him. He's lucid. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were clearer than they'd been in hours. I need to go check on the cattle, he said. Cal and Dietz will have managed the morning, but there's a section in the north pasture that needs... Go, she said. Everything is under control here. He stood up and he was already reaching for his coat when he stopped and turned back to her. And his face had the particular look of a person who wants to say something and doesn't have the exact words for it and has never been good at finding words when it matters. Eliza, he said. She waited. I should have... He stopped. Tried again. When I brought you here, it was because I needed someone. That was true. But I should have... His jaw worked. I should have told you sooner that you were doing more than I'd asked for, more than I'd expected, more than I had any right to expect from the arrangement. She looked at him steadily. The arrangement, she said. He heard the word back and something in his face shifted. That's not... I don't mean it the way it sounds. How do you mean it? He was quiet for a moment. I mean that what you've given this house is more than any arrangement could require, and I don't— He pressed his lips together. I don't know how to account for that. I'm not a man who— Talking about things like this doesn't come naturally to me. I've noticed, she said, and it was dry enough that he almost winced. I'm trying to say thank you, he said, for last night. You're welcome, she said simply. He held her gaze for one more second, then nodded and went for his coat and out through the back door, and she stood in the kitchen and heard his boots on the porch, and then across the yard toward the barn, and she poured herself coffee and sat where he'd been sitting and looked at the same cold white morning through the same window. She thought about what he'd said. More than I had any right to expect from the arrangement. It was a clumsy thing to say. It was also honest, and honesty from Wade Mercer was not a small currency. He spent it carefully, and only when he meant it, and she'd learned to take it at full value. She thought about what she'd given the house, which was how he'd put it, given this house. She'd thought of it differently as work she was doing, tasks she was completing, a debt being paid in labor rather than money. But sitting there in the morning kitchen with the house quiet above her and the smell of coffee and wood smoke around her, she knew it wasn't quite that anymore. Sometime in the past 2 months, without announcement, she had started tending this place the way you tend something that matters to you. Not out of obligation, not from the fear of having nowhere else to go. Something had shifted in how she moved through these rooms, and how she thought about the children's faces in the morning and the sound of Mercer's boots on the porch and the particular quality of quiet that settled over the house at night when everything was where it should be. She didn't have a clean word for it. She wasn't sure she needed one yet. Doc Hennessy came back that afternoon as promised and pronounced Ethan improving with the measured optimism of a man who had learned not to overclaim. Clara shadowed the examination with her arms folded and her eyes tracking every movement the doctor made, asking questions with the specific relentlessness of someone who has decided that information is the one thing she can control. What causes a fever that high? She asked. A number of things, Hennessy said. What caused this one? Infection of some kind. His body fought it. How do you know it won't come back? Hennessy looked at her with the expression of a man who was not used to being cross-examined by a 6-year-old and was recalibrating. I don't know for certain, he said, but the signs are good. Clara absorbed this. You should say that at the beginning, she said. Instead of saying he'll be fine, you don't know if he'll be fine. You should say the signs are good. Hennessy glanced at Eliza. Eliza managed to keep her face neutral. Miss Mercer makes a fair point, she said. He looked at Clara for a moment longer with something that might have been reluctant respect. You're right, he said. The signs are good. He paused. Your mother used to say something similar, about being precise. Clara went very still. You knew her? I did. Hennessy closed his bag with careful hands. She was a woman who thought clearly, asked good questions. He stood up. It runs in the family, seems like. Clara said nothing, but she stood up straighter by about half an inch, in a way that was so small that only someone watching for it would have caught it. That evening, Mercer came in from the range at dark and went directly upstairs, and Eliza heard his low voice through the ceiling and Ethan's thin one answering it, and the sound of it moved through her in a way she wasn't ready to examine directly. She made soup instead, real soup with the last of the bone stock and whatever root vegetables were still good in the cellar, the kind of thing that was more work than the situation strictly required but felt necessary anyway. Clara appeared at the kitchen door. He's better, she said. He told Papa about the hawk. Good. A pause. Clara came into the kitchen and sat at the table in her usual spot and watched Eliza stir the pot. You were scared last night, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, Eliza said. You didn't look it. I know. How do you do that? Eliza thought about it honestly. You picked the thing right in front of you, she said. The cloth, the water. The next thing after that? You don't think past the next thing because the thing past the next thing is too big and it'll stop you. She kept stirring. You think about that later, when it's over. Clara was quiet for a moment. Is that what my father does? I think so, yes. Is that what my mother did? The question landed carefully, the way Clara's harder questions always did. Eliza turned to look at her. The girl was sitting with her hands flat on the table, looking at the pot, her face doing its best at neutral and not entirely succeeding. I didn't know your mother, Eliza said, but from what I've heard about her and from what I can see in you and Ethan, I think she was someone who knew how to stay present in hard moments. And that's exactly what you did last night. You sat with him, and you talked to him, and you didn't fall apart. Clara looked up. I wanted to, she said, very quietly. I know, Eliza said. That's what makes it count. The girl held her gaze for a moment, and something in her face shifted. Not breaking, nothing so dramatic as that, but releasing, like a door held shut by effort that had finally been allowed to swing slightly open. Then she looked back at the pot. The soup smells good, she said. It's going to take another 20 minutes. I'll set the table, Clara said, and got up and went to the cupboard, and that was that. Mercer came down while the soup was still cooking and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Clara, methodically setting out the bowls and Eliza at the stove, and his expression was the one she'd learned to recognize, the one that had no clean name, that lived somewhere between gratitude and something older and more complicated that he hadn't figured out how to address yet. He's asleep, he said. Real sleep, not the other kind. Good, she said. He said to tell you the signs are good. The corner of his mouth pulled. Apparently that's the correct thing to say. Clara, without turning around, said, It is. Mercer looked at his daughter's back, at the careful way she was placing the spoons. He looked at Eliza. She looked back at him, and the lamp between them threw its yellow light across the kitchen. And outside, the winter wind had started again its long, cold conversation with the walls. And it was late, and they were tired, and the house was still standing. She turned back to the stove. He sat down at the table. Clara put a spoon in front of him and then sat in her own chair, and they waited together for the soup to be ready. And none of them said anything, but the silence had a different quality than it used to. It had weight and warmth and shared memory, all the things that silence accumulates when people have been through something together and come out the other side still in the same room. 3 days later, Ethan came downstairs on his own and ate breakfast at the table, pale and thin-looking but entirely himself, demanding to know if the hawk had come back over the east pasture and whether anyone had checked on his stones while he was sick. Your stones are fine, Eliza said. You checked? I told Dietz to look in on them, she said. He stared at her. You told Dietz about my stones? He was very respectful about them. Ethan appeared to process this. Then he said, with the solemnity of a child making an official statement, I'm going to give you the dark red one, the storm-colored one. I want you to have it. Clara looked up from her plate. You love that one. I know, he said simply. That's why. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Eliza set down the serving spoon she was holding and looked at this small, serious boy who had been burning 3 days ago and was now offering her the best thing he had, and she did not trust her voice enough to speak right away. Mercer was looking at his coffee cup with the focused attention of a man who has found something interesting in the middle distance and has decided to study it very carefully. Thank you, Ethan, she said when she had her voice back. I'll keep it on the windowsill, the east window, where the morning light comes through. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his eggs. The dark red stone sat on the east windowsill of her room, and every morning when the light came through the glass, it turned the color of something just before a storm, exactly as Ethan had said it would. She had not expected to still be looking at it in January. The 2-year indenture had felt, on the auction platform in October, like a sentence, something to be endured and survived and eventually escaped. She had signed the paper with her jaw set and her hand steady, and the cold calculation of a person who has decided to treat an unbearable situation as a practical problem. 2 years. That was the frame. That was the thing she would get through. She had stopped thinking in those terms sometime around December, and she hadn't noticed when it happened, which bothered her more than the fact of it. January at Mercer Ranch was a different animal than the autumn had been. The cold was not a condition anymore, but an environment. The world outside the house windows was white and gray and brown. The cattle required twice the work at half the efficiency. The days were short enough that by the time supper was done and the children were in bed, the darkness had been in place for hours. The hands, Cal and Dietz, moved through the ranch like men who had made a private peace with difficulty and expected nothing from the weather except more of the same. Mercer worked harder in January than she'd seen him work in any previous month, which was a significant statement given that she'd never seen him not working. He came in some evenings with ice in his beard and the deep-set tiredness of a man who has been fighting something all day and gained only a draw. She had taken to keeping something warm on the stove regardless of the hour. Not as a rule, just as a fact, the way some facts establish themselves without discussion. He noticed. He said nothing about it directly, but he noticed in the way she'd learned he noticed things. Not with comment, but with a slight shift in how he moved through a room, a fraction less of the guardedness he carried as a default. The children had been different since Ethan's fever. Not transformed, that would be too clean, too complete, but shifted. Ethan was quieter in a different way than before, more anchored somehow, like the illness had burned away a layer of the held-back quality he'd carried since she arrived. He came to her more easily now, without the calculating pause that used to precede it, and he talked more freely, his thoughts tumbling out in the unedited way of a child who has decided you're safe enough not to edit for. Clara's change was subtler and therefore more significant. She still had her armored mornings. She still held positions with the determination of someone who has learned that positions are what keep you standing. But she had stopped watching Eliza for signs of imminent departure. That particular vigilance had eased, replaced by something that was not quite trust and not quite dependence, but lived in the territory between them. One afternoon in the middle of January, Eliza was at the kitchen table writing a letter to her father. He was still with Patterson, still doing better, his handwriting in his last letter steadier than it had been in years, when Clara appeared and sat across from her without invitation or explanation and got out the small notebook she used for drawing and began to draw. They sat like that for an hour, both of them occupied, neither talking, the wood stove ticking beside them. And it was so ordinary that Eliza almost didn't recognize what it was. It was comfort. Clara was seeking her company the way people seek the company of someone they feel safe with, not for conversation, but for presence, for the particular warmth of being near someone who will not require anything from you for an hour. She was careful not to remark on it, because remarking on it would require Clara to have an opinion about it, and Clara having an opinion about it would require her to defend herself, and none of that was necessary. So she kept writing her letter and let the hour be what it was. The trouble with Whitaker came in the second week of January, and it came through Cal. Cal was not a man who brought problems indoors. He solved what he could solve and reported what was beyond solving, and the line between the two was wide by most standards. So when he appeared at the kitchen door on a Wednesday morning and asked to speak with Mercer, and Mercer came out of the barn and the two of them stood in the cold yard talking for 10 minutes, with their voices low and their faces turned away from the house, she knew it was something specific. Mercer came inside afterward and stood in the kitchen with his coat still on and his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim in the slow way he did when he was deciding something. "What happened?" she asked. He looked at her. He'd stopped deliberating about whether to tell her things at some point. She wasn't sure when exactly, but there'd been a transition from him managing information carefully to him simply saying what was true, and she valued it. "Whitaker's been talking," he said, "in town. About you." She kept her expression level. "Saying what?" "Saying that you won't last the winter, that you've been looking for a way out and that he's offered you work and you're considering it." He paused. "Also that the reason I paid what I did at the auction was not what I said it was." The kitchen was very quiet except for the stove. "He's implying something about the arrangement," she said. "Yes." She put down the dish she was holding. "And people are listening?" "Some." He set his hat on the table. "Donahue's not, Hennessy's not, but there are people who will believe something like that because it's more interesting than the truth, and it costs them nothing to believe it." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that I don't give a damn what Whitaker says, but I give a damn that you're hearing it secondhand from me instead of from the town, and I want you to know what's being said so you're not caught off guard." "Thank you," she said, and meant it precisely. "I also want you to know—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "What he's implying is not true, and it's not what this is, what you've done here. It's not that." "I know what it is," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, something in his face that she couldn't fully read. "I'm going to go see him." "Whitaker?" "Yes." "And say what?" "I haven't decided entirely." He picked up his hat. "But I'll be clear." She watched him go back out through the door into the cold. Through the window, she could see him crossing the yard toward the barn with the particular stride of a man who has made up his mind about something, and she stood there with her hands flat on the kitchen table and breathed. She was angry. She hadn't expected the anger to be as clean as it was, She'd thought there would be more humiliation in it, more of the shrinking feeling she'd had on the auction platform. But what she felt was anger, clear and uncomplicated, because Whitaker was trying to take something real and make it small and ugly, and what was real here was not small and not ugly, and she resented the attempt with her whole self. He was gone to town for 3 hours. When he came back, he said only that Whitaker had been informed that any further comments about Eliza or the ranch would have consequences, and that he believed the message had been received. "What kind of consequences?" she asked. "The kind that a man like Whitaker calculates very carefully," he said. She didn't ask for more specifics. The way he said it was enough. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat in the parlor. It had become a thing they did. Increasingly, the parlor in the evenings, the fire, the habit of the same space at the same time. And the Whitaker business sat in the room between them like a piece of furniture that hadn't been there before. "Does it bother you," he said finally, "what people think?" "It bothers me what he's trying to do," she said. "Not what people think. People can think what they want. You said that before, in October." It was true then, too. She looked at the fire. "What bothers me is that it's a lie designed to make me worth less, to make what I'm doing here worth less." She paused, as if the only reason a woman would stay somewhere is because there's something improper happening. He was quiet for a moment. "As if it couldn't be a choice," he said. "As if it couldn't be a choice," she agreed. The fire settled. Outside, the wind was doing its usual work on the house. "Is it?" he said. She looked at him. "Is it what?" "A choice." He was looking at the fire, not at her. "You've been here 3 months. The arrangement. The terms were set. I know you've stayed because of the agreement, but I haven't asked you what you'd choose if the agreement weren't the thing determining it." He stopped. "That's not a clear question." "It's clear enough," she said. He looked at her then. The firelight made his face harder to read than usual, or maybe she was finding it harder to read because the conversation had moved into territory that changed what she was looking for in it. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I know that I'm not staying because I have to. I know that stopped being the reason somewhere around November." She held his gaze. "I know that this place and these children and—" She stopped, chose her next words. "I know that I'm not looking for the door the way I was in October." He was very still. "That's not the same as knowing what you'd choose." "No," she said. "It's not." He looked back at the fire. "I'm not going to ask you to make a decision that isn't ready to be made," he said. I don't want to push you towards something before you know what you actually want." He turned his hat in his hands. He'd brought it in with him, he always did. It was something to do with his hands when he was saying things he found difficult to say. "But I want you to know that what you've done here, what you are here, it's not nothing to me. It's not—" He pressed his lips together. "You saved my children last month. You have given them something back that I didn't know how to give them, and I didn't know anyone else could. And you've—" A long pause. "You've made this house something I want to come back to, and I hadn't—" He stopped. "I hadn't felt that in a while." The fire cracked. Somewhere upstairs, one of the children turned in their sleep. She looked at this man who had bought her at an auction because he didn't like the alternative, who had dusted a chest of drawers for a stranger, who had ridden 2 hours in the dark for a doctor and sat through the worst hours of his fear without letting it swallow him, who said hard things in flat voices and turned his hat in his hands when he meant them. "Wade," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said. It wasn't a complete sentence, and it wasn't a decision, and it wasn't a declaration of anything specific, and he seemed to understand all of that because he nodded once, slowly, and looked back at the fire, and something in the room shifted in a way that was quiet and significant and didn't need any more words around it tonight. She went to bed an hour later and lay looking at the dark ceiling and thought about choices. A choice made under duress was not a choice, her mother had told her once, talking about something entirely different. A neighbor woman who'd married a man she'd been pressured into marrying. A choice made because you have nowhere else to go is not a choice either. A real choice requires that you have options, and you select from among them with full knowledge of what you're selecting. She had options now, in a way she hadn't in October. She had wages. Mercer had been paying her above what the agreement required, as he'd promised, and she had been saving carefully. Not enough to go far, but enough to go somewhere. She had 3 months of demonstrated competence that Hennessy and Donahue and Bess Coulter and several others in the county could speak to. She was not without resources. She was not standing on a platform anymore, which meant that if she stayed, when she stayed, it would be a choice, an actual one, with the full weight and consequence that real choices carried. She was not quite ready to make it yet, but she was closer than she'd been yesterday. February arrived with a storm that pinned them inside for 4 days straight, the kind of Wyoming blizzard that was less a weather event than an argument the land was having with the sky, sustained and absolute. The ranch hands were in the bunkhouse. The cattle were in whatever shelter the land provided, and there was nothing to be done about the ones that weren't. Mercer walked the perimeter of the near buildings twice a day regardless, came in with snow in his eyebrows and his coat stiff with cold, and ate whatever was put in front of him without comment. The 4 of them were together more continuously in those 4 days than they had been at any previous point, which was clarifying in the way that sustained close contact is always clarifying. It reveals who people actually are when there's nowhere to put on a performance. What it revealed, mostly, was ordinary. Ethan and Clara fought about a board game for 2 hours on the second day until Eliza separated them and gave them separate activities in separate rooms, and both of them sulked for 20 minutes and then drifted back together because boredom was worse than the fight. Mercer burned a pan of something she'd left him in charge of while she was dealing with the children, and when she came back to the kitchen there was smoke and a ruined pan, and he was looking at it with an expression of pure male culpability that made her laugh, actually laugh, the sudden kind that catches you off guard. He looked at her laughing, and something happened in his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was that architecture again, the near miss of it. And then she stopped laughing because the room felt different for a moment. On the 3rd day of the storm, Clara asked, with the precision of someone who had been holding the question for a while, "Are you going to stay?" Eliza was mending. It was what she did when the weather was bad and the cabin fever was building. Something with her hands, something that required just enough attention to be meditative. "What makes you ask that now?" she said. "Because we're stuck inside, and I've been thinking," Clara said. "And I want to know." "What does Ethan say?" "Ethan says yes, but Ethan thinks everyone he likes is going to stay." Clara's voice was carefully flat. "He thought Mrs. Fowler was going to stay, and she left in 4 days." 3, Eliza said. 4. Ethan said 3. "Ethan is wrong," Clara said. "She was here for breakfast on the 4th day. I remember because she made porridge, and it was terrible." Eliza put down the mending. She looked at this child who had been measuring people for reliability since she was 4 years old, who had developed a system of assessment more rigorous than most adults managed, who was asking a direct question because she was tired of not knowing the answer and had decided the risk of asking was worth it. "I don't want to tell you something I'm not certain of," she said. "You deserve better than that." Clara's face stayed very still. "So you don't know. I know that I'm not planning to leave. I know that every week I've been here I've wanted to leave less. I know that you and your brother matter to me in a way that is," she searched for the honest word, "real. Not arrangement real. Actually real. But. There's no but." She held Clara's gaze. "That's the whole thing." Clara looked at her for a long moment with those measuring eyes. "Mrs. Adler said she cared about us too," she said. "On the first day." "I know. You didn't say it on the first day." "No. You said it now, on the—" Clara counted. 93rd day. Eliza stared at her. "You've been counting." "I count things," Clara said with simple dignity. "Ethan has his stones. I count things." 93 days, Eliza said, half to herself. 93 days, and you still burned the porridge twice, and you argue with Papa about the account books. And you made Dietz feel bad about the fence repair, even though it wasn't his fault, and you cried once in your room and thought nobody heard. Clara delivered this inventory without judgment, just as information. "You're not perfect." "No," Eliza agreed. "I'm not." "Good," Clara said. "Perfect people leave. They can't stand it when things are hard." She picked up her notebook. "I think you'll stay." She went back to her drawing, and the storm pressed against the windows, and Eliza sat with her mending in her lap, and the unexpected weight of being known pressing gently on her chest. That evening, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and the storm had dropped from howling to a steady moan. She went to where Mercer was sitting at the kitchen table with the account books and sat across from him. "Clara counted," she said. He looked up. "Counted what?" "Days. She's been counting the days I've been here. She knows today is 93. He looked at her with an expression she was learning to read as his version of something that other men would show more completely on their faces. "That sounds like Clara," he said. "She also cataloged my failures, specifically." Eliza listed them. The porridge, the account book arguments, the thing with Dietz that she'd handled wrong and knew she'd handled wrong, the crying she hadn't thought anyone had heard. Mercer was quiet for a moment. "You cried in your room?" "Once, in November. It was a bad day." He said nothing for a moment. "I heard it too," he said finally. "I didn't know what to do with it, so I went back to the barn." She looked at him. "You should have knocked." "I know." He held her gaze. "I was afraid of what I'd say." The lamp between them flickered in a draft from somewhere. Outside, the storm kept its steady work. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said. About choices." He was very still. "I told you I wasn't ready to decide. In January." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm still not. I don't want to be the kind of person who makes a decision because a storm trapped them inside with someone for 4 days and all the feeling of it pushed them past where they were ready to go." She paused. "But I want you to know that I'm closer. And I want you to know that it's not obligation moving me in that direction." He looked at her with the particular expression she'd come to think of as his most honest one. Not guarded, not managed, just the actual face of a man sitting with something difficult and not trying to make it easier than it was. "What is moving you?" he said. She thought about it carefully, because he deserved careful. "The stone on the windowsill," she said. "The fact that you dust things for people before you know them. The way you said both of them, whatever state they're in. The way you rode to town in the dark." She looked at him. "The way you went back to the barn in November instead of knocking, which was the wrong thing, but I understand why." His jaw worked. "That's a strange list." "You're a strange man," she said. "You're also—" She stopped. "You're a good man. I don't say that the way people say it when they don't mean much by it. I mean it the way you mean things, the actual way." He was quiet for so long that she thought she'd said too much, moved too far past where the conversation was ready to go. Then he said, "I have thought about very little else since October except how to be fair to you. How to not make what happened to you into another kind of trap. How to give you room to become whatever you're going to become, here or somewhere else, without me wanting something from you, making it harder." He paused. "And I have failed at that in the sense that I do want something. I want—" He stopped, started again. "I want you here. Not because I need help with the children or the house. Because the house is different when you're in it. Because I'm different." He met her eyes. "And I don't know what to do with that because you're still technically— the agreement is still—" "Stop," she said. He stopped. "The agreement is a piece of paper," she said. "It is not the thing that is happening in this house." "No," he said. "It is not." The storm outside had settled into something lower and steadier, almost like breathing. The lamp held. The house held. She sat across from a man who had said the truest thing he knew how to say, in the flattest, most unadorned way he had available to him. And she understood that this was as open as he was going to be able to make himself, that the door was as wide as his nature allowed it to go, and that what she did next was going to be a real choice made by a person with options who knew what she was choosing and why. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He went very still. He looked at her hand on his and then at her face, and his expression was the one she'd never fully seen before. Not guarded, not managed, not held at distance, just entirely present and entirely undefended, the face of a man who had not allowed himself to hope for something and was now sitting with the fact that the thing was real. "I'm not deciding tonight," she said. "I told you that, but I want you to know what direction I'm facing." His hand turned under hers and held it. His grip was careful, like something he might break if he wasn't precise about how he held it. "All right," he said. "When I decide," she said, "it will be because I want to. Not because I'm afraid of being alone, not because I don't have anywhere else to go. Because I want to." "I wouldn't want it any other way," he said. She believed him. She went to bed at 10 o'clock and lay looking at the ceiling with her hand still warm from his, and she was afraid, which she expected, and she was certain, which she hadn't expected at all. Not certain of the outcome. Outcomes on the frontier were never certain. Winter could take things. Seasons could break what seemed solid. Nothing was guaranteed by want alone. But certain of herself, of what she was facing and why. Of the difference between a choice made from fear and a choice made from something that had grown quietly and stubbornly over 93 days in the same way that real things grew. Not announcing themselves, not asking permission, just putting down roots until the day you looked and found them deeper than you'd known. The storm broke in the night. By morning, the sky was clear and bitter cold and absolutely blue. The kind of blue that only existed in Wyoming in winter, so saturated and absolute it looked painted. Ethan saw it first and called from the top of the stairs, and both children ran to the windows in their nightclothes, and Mercer appeared in the kitchen doorway with his coffee, and looked at Eliza, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything about the night before or what it had been. But he handed her a cup of coffee and stood beside her at the window where the children were pressing their faces to the cold glass, and they stood together and watched the blue morning come in over the white land, and the dark red stone on the east windowsill caught the first direct light of the sun and glowed exactly the color of the sky before a storm. She made her decision on a Thursday in early March, when nothing particular was happening. That was the thing she would remember most about it afterward. Not that it came during a moment of crisis or clarity or dramatic weather, but that it came on an ordinary Thursday while she was hanging laundry in the cold morning air and watching Ethan chase one of the barn cats across the yard, while Clara stood at the fence line telling the horses things in a low, private voice that Eliza couldn't hear from where she was standing. The sky was pale and washed out, the kind of sky that hadn't decided yet what it was going to do with the day. Her hands were cold from the wet laundry. Her back ached from the week. She looked at the two children and the horses and the dark timber house and the land running flat and endless in every direction, and the decision was simply there. The way a thing is there when you finally stop looking around it and look directly at it instead. She was going to stay. Not because the agreement required it, not because she had nowhere else to go. Because this was the place where the morning light hit the dark red stone and turned it gold. And because she knew which hen laid most consistently and which horse spooked at shadows and what Ethan's face looked like when he was about to cry and didn't want anyone to see. And because the account books made more sense now than they had in October, and she had opinions about them that Mercer actually listened to, and because some part of her that had been clenched since her mother died had slowly, incrementally, without fanfare, unclenched here. She finished hanging the laundry and went inside and found Mercer at the kitchen table with his coffee, going over a letter from a cattle buyer in Cheyenne. She sat across from him and waited until he looked up. "I've decided," she said. He put the letter down. He looked at her with that careful attention she'd come to trust entirely. "All right," he said. "I want to stay." She held his gaze. Not under the agreement, not as hired help, not as something that happened because of a debt and an auction. "I want to stay as, She paused. "I want to stay as someone who chose to be here. If that's something you still want." He was quiet for long enough that she felt the first edge of doubt. Then he said, "I've wanted that since November." "You could have said something." "You needed to get there on your own," he said. "I knew that." "That's either very wise or very frustrating," she said. "Probably both," he said, and the near miss of his smile appeared. But this time it didn't stop at near miss. It went the whole way, slow and unpracticed, like a door that had been closed long enough that the hinges needed a moment. It changed his entire face. She'd wondered what it would look like when it finally happened. It was worth the wait. He asked her to marry him that same afternoon, which she hadn't expected so soon, standing in the barn of all places while he was checking on a mare that had been favoring her left foreleg. He didn't preface it with a long speech or frame it with ceremony. He just turned from the horse and said, "I want to do this right. I want you to have the actual thing, not the arrangement version of it. So I'm asking." A pause. "Will you marry me?" It wasn't even quite a question, grammatically. It was more like a statement he was making about what he wanted and trusting her to respond to, which was, she thought, exactly how Wade Mercer would ask someone to marry him. "Yes," she said, "but I have conditions." He blinked. "Conditions?" I'm not going to stop telling you when I think the account books are wrong. You've never stopped. And I'm not going to become a different person because we're married. I'm going to be exactly who I am. I'm not asking you to be anyone else, he said. With a slight edge that told her he was offended, she felt the need to say it, which she found reassuring. Good, she said. Then yes, completely. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with one rough, careful hand, and that was that. Telling the children was its own particular event. She and Mercer sat with them that evening after supper, and he told them plainly that he'd asked Eliza to marry him, that she'd said yes, and that she was going to be part of the family officially and permanently from here forward. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, without decoration, just the facts laid out and trusted to be enough. Ethan burst into tears immediately, which startled everyone, including him, and then insisted loudly that he wasn't crying, that something was in his eye, and kept saying this even as tears ran freely down his face. And Eliza pulled him into her arms while he made his case about the eye situation with diminishing conviction, and she held him and said nothing because nothing was needed. And he cried for about 90 seconds and then stopped as abruptly as he'd started and pulled back and said, with complete composure, "I knew you were going to stay." "You did," she agreed. "I told Clara." "You were right," she said. Clara had not cried. Clara would never cry at a thing like this at a kitchen table in front of people. She'd sat through Mercer's announcement with her face very controlled and her hands flat on the table. And when Ethan was done with his 90 seconds, she'd looked at Eliza with those measuring dark eyes. "Will you still be Eliza?" she asked. "What do you mean?" "When you're married. Will you still be Eliza, or will you be—" She seemed to be working something out. "Or will you be different?" "I'll still be Eliza, same person. I'll just also be a Mercer, on paper." Clara seemed to consider this. "Eliza Mercer," she said, trying the sound of it. "That's all right." A pause, very deliberate. "You can call me Clara, not Miss Mercer, just Clara," which was, from Clara, approximately equivalent to another child throwing their arms around your neck and weeping with joy. Eliza understood the offer for what it was. "Just Clara," she said. "All right," Clara nodded. She appeared to be done with the emotional portion of the evening. "Can I be excused? I want to draw." The wedding was in April, which wasn't enough time by the standards of towns that had churches and social expectations and women who organized things. But it was the frontier and the standards were different, and nobody was particularly interested in waiting. Bess Coulter organized it anyway, because Bess Coulter organized things by nature, regardless of whether she'd been asked to, and Eliza found that she was grateful for it in a way she hadn't anticipated. She'd told herself she didn't need anything formal, that the decision was the thing, and the ceremony was just paperwork with witnesses, and then Bess had appeared one afternoon with practical opinions about the small things: flowers, a decent meal afterward, which of the neighboring families should be invited. And Eliza had sat at the kitchen table and felt something loosen in her chest, the specific release of someone who has been holding everything together for so long they'd forgotten they were allowed to be held together by someone else for a moment. "You've been managing everything since you got here," Bess told her, not unkindly. "Let someone else manage this." "I'm not good at that," Eliza said. "I know. Practice." Her father came. That was the thing she hadn't been certain of until 2 weeks before, when Patterson sent word that Thomas Hartwell was well enough to travel and that Patterson himself would drive him out in his wagon as a personal favor, which said something about the kind of man Patterson was. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon looking better than she'd seen him in 2 years, thinner than he should have been, and the cough was still there, lower and less constant, but his eyes were clearer and his back was straighter, and when he climbed down from Patterson's wagon and saw her on the porch, he stood for a moment looking at her the way a person looks at something they were afraid they'd damaged beyond repair and had since found mostly intact. She went down the steps and held him for a long time. "You look well," he said into her hair. "You look more than well." "So do you," she said, which was only partly true but was true enough. He met Mercer in the yard, and the two of them shook hands, and whatever calibration had needed to happen between them seemed to happen in the first 30 seconds of that handshake. Some mutual assessment conducted without words that left both men seeming satisfied. Her father looked at Mercer for a moment afterward and said, "You kept your word." "I tried to," Mercer said. "More than tried," her father said. "I can see it." Mercer didn't say anything to that, But he met the older man's eyes, and that was its own kind of answer. The children took to Thomas Hartwell with a speed that surprised Eliza. Ethan in particular followed him around for the first 2 days like a small, determined shadow, asking questions about everything: where he'd been born, what his farm had been like, whether he'd ever seen a mountain, whether he knew how to whittle. Her father answered every question with the patience of a man who found being needed by a child exactly as restorative as it apparently was. And by the second evening, they were sitting on the porch in the cold, with a piece of wood between them, and Ethan learning the beginning of something with a knife he wasn't quite old enough for, but was being supervised on extremely carefully. Clara observed this from a distance for a full day before she approached, which was Clara's method: study, assess, then engage on her own terms. She came to Thomas Hartwell on the second morning and stood in front of him and said, without preamble, "Did you teach her?" He looked at her. "Teach Eliza what?" "How to stay," Clara said. "When things are hard, she stays. Did you teach her that?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, and Eliza, who was pretending to be very busy with something at the kitchen window, watched his face do several things before it settled into something honest. "I think her mother taught her that," he said. "I mostly taught her what not to do the last few years, which might have been its own kind of lesson." He looked at Clara. "Why?" "I want to know where it comes from," Clara said, "so I know if I have it." Thomas Hartwell looked at this 6-year-old who had been measuring people for reliability since before she was old enough to articulate why. And he said, "You've been staying too, through things that would have broken a lot of people. I'd say you have it." Clara considered this. "You're her father," she said. "You're supposed to say good things about the people connected to her." "I'm also too old to bother lying about things that don't need lying about," he said. She seemed to accept this. She sat down next to him on the porch steps and watched Ethan chase the barn cat, and Thomas Hartwell sat beside her and watched too, and they stayed like that in a surprisingly companionable silence until Eliza called them in for lunch. The wedding was on a Saturday, in the yard behind the house, because the parlor was too small for everyone, and the barn smelled too much like a barn, and the day turned out cold but clear, the sky that deep absolute blue that Wyoming sometimes produced, as if apologizing for everything else it put you through. Donahue came, and Hennessy, and Bess Coulter, and Patterson, and Cal and Dietz, who cleaned up considerably for the occasion and stood together slightly apart from the others, with the particular awkwardness of working men in social situations, and 4 neighboring families who had, over the course of the winter, arrived at their own conclusions about Eliza Hartwell and what she meant to the Mercer household. Justice Alderman, who rode a circuit through 3 counties and had the weathered neutrality of a man who had officiated at every variety of human occasion the frontier produced, stood in front of them with his coat buttoned against the cold and said the necessary words in the practical, straightforward manner that suited everyone present. She had not expected to be nervous. She was nervous. Not about the decision. The decision was made and solid, and she had no doubt about it. She was nervous the way you're nervous before something real happens. The particular alertness of a moment you know you're going to carry for the rest of your life and don't want to get wrong. She wore the blue cotton dress her mother had made. It was not a wedding dress by any standard measure. It was a good dress, a saved dress, the dress she'd worn on the auction platform, and worn again the first morning she'd cooked breakfast in Mercer's kitchen, and worn on a dozen occasions since. She'd thought about wearing something else, and then she'd thought about it more carefully and understood that this was exactly the right dress, because her mother had made it, and because she'd stood on that platform in it and survived, and everything since had grown from that survival. And wearing it felt like bringing everyone with her who deserved to be here but wasn't. Mercer looked at her when she came out of the house and across the yard toward where he was standing, and his face did the thing that had taken 93 days to produce the first time and now happened somewhat more readily. Not easily. He was still not a man built for easy expression, but willingly. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they'd stopped believing they'd get to have. She reached him and stood next to him and said quietly, so only he could hear, "Stop looking at me like that, or I'm going to do something embarrassing in front of all these people." "Like what?" he said, equally quiet. "I don't know yet. Something." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'll try to look more neutral. Please." He didn't, particularly. The ceremony was short. The words were plain. She said yes when it was her turn to say yes, and he said yes when it was his. and Justice Alderman announced them married with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had a long ride ahead of him and appreciated brevity, and the assembled people of Caldwell Creek County made the sounds that people make at weddings, and Ethan threw himself at both of them simultaneously in a way that nearly knocked Mercer sideways, and Clara, standing slightly to the left, allowed her father to put his arm around her and stood there in the circle of it with her face tilted toward the sky for a moment, before she composed herself and reached across and took Eliza's hand. Just took it, held it, said nothing. Eliza held on. Bess had organized a meal in the barn, which did smell like a barn but had been swept and laid with tables and was warm from the bodies of 20 people and the 2 braziers Cal had set up in the corners. And there was more food than the occasion strictly required because the frontier understood that feeding people was how you marked the things that mattered. Her father sat next to Ethan and looked, for the first time in years, like a man who wasn't carrying something too heavy for his frame. Cal and Dietz turned out to be surprisingly good company once the formality of the ceremony was behind them, and Dietz told a story about a horse and a fence post that shouldn't have been as funny as it was. Mercer sat beside her for most of it, occasionally called away into someone's conversation, and returning with the slight relief of a man who finds large social gatherings technically manageable, but personally draining. The third time he came back, he refilled her coffee without asking and sat down and said, under the noise of the room, "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Getting there," he said. "That's honest." "I've had some practice," he said, and she knew he meant from her, from the winter of being asked to say true things plainly, and she felt the warmth of it settle in her chest. She looked out over the table, her father's face, Clara's dark head bent over something she'd brought to draw on because Clara brought something to draw on everywhere. Ethan mid-story, with his hands already in the air gesturing at something. Bess managing the food with the focused competence of someone who had found her highest purpose. The neighboring families talking with the volume of people who don't see each other often enough. Cal nodding seriously at something Hennessy was saying. And she thought about the girl who had stood on a platform in October with her best dress on and her jaw set, and her eyes fixed on a broken sign above a general store. That girl had been surviving. That was the honest word for it. She had been doing the calculations of survival, measuring exits, preserving herself for a future she hadn't been able to picture yet, but had refused to stop believing existed. She had not been wrong to do that. Survival was not a small thing. Survival was sometimes the only honest response to what the world put in front of you, and there was no shame in it, no poverty of spirit. You held on with both hands, and you did not let go, and that was enough. That was exactly enough. Until the day it wasn't all that was required of you anymore. But she was not surviving now. She was something past surviving, standing in a barn on a cold, clear April day with cold coffee and her mother's dress, and 20 people who had made room for her in their understanding of what this place and this family were. She was not the sum of a debt, or the product of a desperate transaction, or the inevitable departure that everyone had predicted. She was Eliza Mercer on a ranch she knew the way she knew her own hands, with 2 children who had taught her more about courage than any adult ever had, and a man beside her who said hard things in flat voices and meant every one of them. The thing people didn't tell you, the thing Eliza understood now that she wouldn't have understood in October or even December, was that belonging didn't arrive like weather, sudden and total, changing everything at once. It built the way the ranch had built, the way everything on the frontier built, slowly, under difficulty, with setbacks and imperfect materials and days when you couldn't see the progress because you were too tired to look for it. You didn't one day simply belong to a place and its people. You built belonging out of ordinary days and ordinary choices, out of 93 counted days and stones on windowsills and braided hair and soup left warm on the stove, and 2 in the morning with a burning child, and the 4 days of a storm that showed you who people were when performance wasn't an option. It wasn't romantic, the building of it. It was mostly work, but the thing you built at the end of all that work was real in a way that things given to you for free could never quite be, because you knew what it had cost and what it had required and what you'd had to become to hold it. The barn emptied slowly as the afternoon went toward evening. Her father was the last to leave, Patterson waiting with his wagon in the yard, and he held her again at the door, and she felt the difference in him. Steadier, less collapsed, some essential support back in place. "Your mother would have liked him," he said, She would have made him uncomfortable and asked him difficult questions and liked him anyway. That sounds about right, Eliza said. She would have liked these children. He pulled back and looked at his daughter. She would have liked who you are here. She pressed her lips together briefly. Go before I do something embarrassing. I love you, he said. Write more often than you have been. I'll write every week. You won't. Twice a month, she said. I'll commit to twice a month. He climbed up into Patterson's wagon and they drove away down the road that ran east toward Caldwell Creek, and she watched until they were small in the distance and then turned back toward the house. Mercer was on the porch, waiting. The children were inside. She could hear Ethan's voice raised in something and Clara's response with the particular tone of someone managing a situation. The lamps were lit in the downstairs windows, and the smoke was rising from the left chimney, and the sky was going orange and gold in the west, the kind of gold that Clara's mother had called a gift, the kind that wasn't guaranteed, the kind that made the gray days worth getting through. She walked across the yard and up the steps, and he held the door for her without ceremony, and she went inside. The house was warm. The house was loud with the children settling their dispute, which Eliza assessed from the sound of it required no intervention. The kitchen smelled like the meal Bess had sent home with them, enough for 3 more days. The dark red stone sat on the east windowsill, catching the last of the day's light. This was not a perfect life. The account books would still have difficult Sundays. The winter would come again, and it would be harder than the last one in some ways, and easier in others. Clara would have her armored mornings, and Ethan would disappear into silences, and Mercer would go back to the barn when he couldn't find words, and she would burn things on the stove and handle things wrong sometimes, and be too tired on the days that required her most. None of it would be smooth. None of it would be certain. But they were all, every one of them, exactly where they had chosen to be, and on the endless frontier where survival was the baseline and nothing was promised, and everything had to be built from whatever you had on hand. That choice, plain, imperfect, made with open eyes, was the most solid thing any of them owned. She went to the kitchen and started on supper, and behind her the door opened and closed as Mercer came in, and upstairs the argument resolved into laughter, and the fire held, and outside the gold light finished its work on the sky, and the dark came in quietly, the way it did out here, without fuss, just the end of one day and the beginning of what came next.
If you have the money or all internet, it is free, but it's really slow. First one. Anxiety the song? Yep. Like the TikTok one? Yep. That's it.
My anxiety.
I fucking hate that song, man. Men don't have anxiety, true.
Anxiety, oh.
Hark! The Tua angels sing. What the fuck? 65 stream streak. Are you beating that, Ben?
Yes, I'm almost at like 90, I think.
Holy fuck.
Fuck you, Pike. Fuck out of here.
I'm on 73 on this account. You better roll on!
I think Hina's was higher than me before she got banned.
I can't believe she got banned there. That shit was crazy.
I can. She said some vile shit.
She did. I think it's 100, including the other. That was Brimbo Genghis 9/11, bro. The night of long knives.